Yes, let's begin. Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. And thank you, everybody, for coming to join us this evening. It's fantastic to have such a large turnout for this Central European seminar event hosted by University College London School of Slavonic and East European Studies. It's certainly uh, well, it's definitely a silver lining of this day and age that we're able to have an event of this type with so many people. I doubt 126 and counting participants would be able to fit in the Masaryk room on Taviton Street. So, as I said, we're delighted to have everyone here for this event, this roundtable discussion on Hungary under Orban, the first 10 years. And as Claudia mentioned before I started talking, this event is being recorded, and we would ask everybody to have their microphone muted and actually their video off as well if you're not presenting or asking a question. And the format for this event will be as follows. We will have 3 20-minute presentations, followed by question and answer from the audience. And the way the question and answer will work is that everybody should write in, everyone who wants to ask a question should write in the chat that they would like to ask a question, and I will call on you in the order in which the questions appear. It's possible that if you don't want to ask in person, or if your connection doesn't permit it, you can ask the question in the chat, and I will read the question out for the speaker or speakers. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for the evening in the order in which they'll be presenting. First off, we will have Balázs Szent Iványi, a political economist at Aston University here in the UK, and he will be talking on the subject Eastern Opening and Protecting Persecuted Christians, how Viktor Orban instrumentalized foreign policy for domestic purposes. Then we'll hear from Dora Piroshka, also a political economist who's based at Central European University in Vienna, as well as the Corvinus University in Budapest. And she will be talking on the subject of evaluating Orban's financial nationalism, countering the structural power of finance while weakening democracy. And then our third speaker is a historian, our very own Dr. Thomas Lohrmann, who also, like me, teaches Central European history at UCL SSEES, and his talk is called The Creation of a New Government Party, Explaining Orban's Electoral Successes. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Balázs. You have about 20 minutes.
Thanks very much, Jakub. And I'd also like to thank Tom and the colleagues at SSEES for organizing this event and inviting me. So as Jakub's mentioned, I'm going to talk about foreign policy under Orban. And I'm not going to be providing a full analysis. Rather, I'm just going to be highlighting a couple of points that are maybe a bit more interesting, and it makes sense to look behind these points. I'll look at a couple of priorities maybe of the Orban government, how they shifted in the past 10 years, and what they tell us more broadly about politics in Hungary. Although some of you might be expecting some discussion about issues going on in the EU at the moment with the threat by Hungary and Poland of vetoing the recovery package and the EU budget, I'm actually not going to be talking about the EU much. In fact, not at all. It's just such a separate topic, and I mean, there's a lot of discussion going on about it. So I thought I'd focus on other aspects of Hungarian foreign policy during these 10 years, which may have received less attention. So without further ado, before I talk about the 10 years of Orban, I'd maybe just like to go back a bit to the early 1990s and talk about what the newly democratic Hungary's foreign policy objectives were. It was a rare era when Hungarian politicians could still agree on some things. And there was a foreign policy consensus in the early 1990s of the strategic priorities that Hungary needs to pursue. And this had three pillars: integration in the EU and joining NATO, good relations with the neighboring countries, and protecting the rights and supporting the welfare of ethnic Hungarians abroad. So this foreign policy strategy served Hungary reasonably well during the 1990s, but obviously with Hungary joining NATO in 1999 and then the EU in 2004, the strategy became obsolete. And after this, we could witness an era of foreign policy drift, basically, in Hungary. So the social liberal governments between 2002 and 2010 made little efforts at strategic foreign policy thinking. There was a foreign policy strategy accepted in 2008, but it wasn't really implemented, and it was basically overshadowed by the global financial crisis, which hit Hungary very hard anyway. So coming up to 2010 and the Fidesz government, in this sense, it was quite a welcome change that the Fidesz government seemed to introduce greater strategic thinking into foreign policy after basically a decade of drift. So what were the elements of this greater strategic thinking in foreign policy? The main element was focused on greater assertiveness in implementing the national interest and protecting sovereignty, while also expanding foreign policy thinking beyond Europe. And this is the aspect of it that I'd like to maybe talk a bit more about, this later aspect of a more globally engaged Hungary. So the new official foreign policy strategy was entitled Global Opening, and it was adopted in 2011. Interestingly, it was written down and it was publicly available. That happens less and less frequently nowadays with the government. The main premise of the global opening strategy was that Hungary needs to broaden and diversify its heavily EU-centric economic relations, mainly focusing on external trade towards emerging and developing countries which had previously been neglected by Hungary's foreign policy. So basically, there was an explicit emphasis in this new foreign policy strategy on business and exports, and this was made very clear in 2014 when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had its name changed to Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And to a degree, this was a sensible foreign policy ambition. The need to diversify Hungary's heavily EU and within that Germany-centric economic relations was very clear, especially in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis and the European sovereign debt crisis, which followed it. There were significant steps to implement the global opening strategy. So for example, several new embassies were opened in developing countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Angola, Ethiopia, Colombia, Peru, just to name a couple of them. There were several trips and delegations to various emerging economies. And as it's been well documented elsewhere, Hungary has developed especially close ties with countries like Turkey, Russia, and also many other former Soviet states. A stranger example was Hungary discovering its Turkic heritage, for example, and joining the Turkic Council as an observer in 2018. This left quite a few Hungarians baffled. There were also attempts at greater global engagement. There was more strategic attention paid to Hungary's foreign aid, which isn't huge amounts, but was the first government actually to formulate a strategy for it and also increase resources. Hungary had a really high-profile role in the UN when formulating the Sustainable Development Goals. It was actually co-chair of the working group together with Kenya. It has also championed water issues in the UN. So there's evidence of a greater global engagement in international organizations like the UN as well. But if we want to draw a balance of the global opening strategy at its success. And since most of it was framed in terms of foreign trade, we just need to look at whether the structure of Hungary's foreign trade has changed in the past decade or so. And if we compare Hungary's exports, for example, in 2010, and probably the latest available data would be from 2018 or something like that, there's almost no change whatsoever. So 89% of Hungary's exports goes to Europe, just as in 2010 and also in 2018. And the share of Russia, which has been an important partner in rhetoric, has actually decreased from 3.5% to 1.5%. Germany is still just as dominant in Hungary's foreign trade as it was 10 years ago. So there's very little to show in terms of reorienting Hungary's foreign economic relations to the emerging and developing world. So these were the newfound global ambitions of Hungary. I'll talk a bit more later on at the end of my presentation. I'll talk a bit about what this all means or how we make sense of these ambitions, but I'm going to touch two more with these global ambitions. But Hungary is a small country and its neighbor, and the relations Hungary has with its neighbors also matter because of the significant Hungarian minorities living in some of these countries. And indeed, these relations with Hungarian minorities have figured very prominently in Orban's foreign policy. In 2011, an easy path to naturalization, together with the right to vote in Hungarian elections, was granted to ethnic Hungarians, and this did lead to some tensions with governments in the neighboring countries, especially with Slovakia and Romania. The government has also provided significant amounts of funding for cultural and educational projects in the neighboring countries with ethnic Hungarians. And the government has interfered in Hungarian minority politics in these countries. There were often various factions or sides of Hungarian minority elites, which Fidesz seemed to favor and was very much supportive of. We also need to mention the Visegrad group, an informal or semi-formal grouping of Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And there were always questions in the past decades on how effectively this group can work. There are quite a lot of differences in the group in terms of foreign policy, but in the past decade, I think we can argue that it has managed to unite and present a united front despite its differences on a number of issues. Immigration especially handed Hungary and the V4 a big win, because they basically united and blocked the EU's ability to reach a European-wide agreement on the issue. And indeed, the Visegrad group has now become a key player on EU debates. Right. Talk more about immigration later. Hungary has also further crystallized its special relationship with Poland. Hungary and Poland have always thought of each other as close friends, but this has gotten a new meaning in the past couple of years, most recently shown by the two countries' threats to veto the EU's budget and the recovery package around concerns of tying disbursements to rule of law criteria. So there seems to be very good relations, especially with Poland in the Visegrad group, while the other two countries seems to want to distance themselves from this axis of illiberalism, if we can call it that. Maybe just one more thing to mention about Hungary's increased assertiveness in foreign policy is its debate with Ukraine. and the deteriorating relationship that Hungary has with Ukraine. Ukraine passed the controversial education law in 2017, which affects minority language users, including ethnic Hungarians living in the Transcarpathia region of Ukraine. Hungary, as a retaliation, has basically blocked Ukraine developing closer ties with the EU and NATO ever since. And Hungarians have been seen by many observers as a bit disproportionate and also benefiting Russia, for example. So I mentioned that I'll say a few more words about immigration, and also how Hungary's greater regional and global assertiveness has led it to become or present itself as the champion of oppressed Christian minorities across the world. So during the refugee crisis of 2015, we all know that Hungary closed its southern border toward refugees. The government labeled all arrivals to the country as economic migrants who were not eligible for asylum protection. And Hungary also opposed any mandatory redistribution scheme of refugees among EU members, together with its Visegrad peers. But there was a clear need to also improve its image and send a more positive message. So in 2017, Hungary launched a new bilateral aid program called Hungary Helps, slightly paternalistic name, with the declared aim of addressing the root causes of migration. So the program claimed to focus on supporting Christian minority communities in conflict zones, supporting rehabilitation and rebuilding, and creating the circumstances in which those minority communities would be able to remain in their homelands. The government also organized a series of international conferences on the persecution of Christians and funded reports on the topic. It's not quite clear how much money was exactly devoted to the Hungary Helps program, but it's very clear that protecting Christians from persecution has in the past 3 or 4 years clearly emerged as the new cornerstone of Hungary's foreign policy. An interesting contradiction to know that Hungary rarely talks about protecting Christian communities in countries like Turkey or Azerbaijan or some of its closer friends. In fact, in the recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Hungary very clearly sided with Azerbaijan as an interesting note. So what we see in the past 10 years is a much more assertive foreign policy, talk about Hungarian interests, protecting these interests, although there isn't much discussion on where these interests come from or who formulates these interests. And we see this greater assertiveness both in the neighborhood, but also globally. And the global dimension is driven by trade. And now there's this element of protecting Christian minorities from persecution. So in the remaining couple of minutes that I have, I just want to briefly reflect on what all this tells us about Hungarian politics and domestic politics. How do we make sense of this new, much more assertive foreign policy? Is this the foreign policy that smallish, some would maybe argue mid-sized country like Hungary really needs? In some cases, yes. As I've already hinted at it, diversifying trade relations, for example, is not a bad idea in itself and could increase the resilience of the Hungarian economy to crises. But you need to be realistic with what can be achieved here. Most of Hungary's trade happens in the global value chains of multinational companies. There's no significant group of export-ready small and medium enterprises in Hungary, as Germany's Mittelstand, for example, which would react to these kinds of government incentives. And it's much more difficult, obviously, for a single government to change the direction of trade if it happens, if it's dominated by the considerations of multinational companies. So I'd argue that this part is probably reasonable, but it's difficult to achieve any change. However, for the most part, I argue that foreign policy has actually been instrumentalized to support Fidesz's domestic policy objectives. And again, let's first look at the case of arguing for reorienting trade flows. So the Orban government has viewed Europe's various economic crises, and let's not forget that Orban came to power when Europe was in the middle of its W-shaped recession. He viewed this crisis as a fundamental economic decline of the West in face of strengthening new powers. And so the argument went that Hungary needs investment from abroad, and it might not be able to get this from a declining Europe, and it needs to gain access to new markets and to diversify its dependency from Europe. Also, Fidesz constructed an identity for itself as the protector of Hungarian interest. It successfully cast the previous social liberal government as a servant of the interests of multinational capital and Brussels. And indeed, the EU itself was cast as an enemy of the country, intent on dominating Hungary, and multinational companies are basically one of its agents. The frequently repeated idea that multinational companies reap huge profits in Hungary, according to narratives in Fidesz and also the more extreme right in the country. So a logical step, if this is the narrative the government is projecting them towards domestic constituencies, it's a logical step to contest this situation and try to decrease reliance on the EU in actions as well, and also on multinationals. And this also links with Fidesz's attempts to try and create a Hungarian-owned entrepreneurial class through favoring them in public procurements, but that's kind of another story. So developing close ties with various autocratic and other dubious regimes in the East is aimed to show to Hungarian voters that there is life outside of the EU, to paraphrase one of Orban's frequently repeated catchphrases. The EU isn't the only source of prosperity, alternatives are possible, and the Hungarian economy just needs to shift. Now, how much this is actually the case is up for debate. And we can talk about it in the discussion, but this is the narrative, and so these actions can be seen as backing up this domestic political narrative. We can make a similar case with the issue of protecting persecuted Christians. So after 2015, the government whipped up anti-immigrant sentiments. It portrayed Europe as basically being at the mercy of an Islamic onslaught. And this rhetoric needed to be backed up as well, that Christians are in danger and Christians need to be protected. And I don't want to play down the issue of Christian persecution. In many parts of the world, it is a serious issue, and some argue that Christians are the most persecuted religion. So not playing down the significance of the topic, but you can ask the question of what can a small country with relatively limited resources actually do. So the government clearly needed to develop a more positive image. You can't just say, no, we don't want immigrants. We're not letting anyone in. We're closing the borders. Immigration is clearly not popular in Hungary. It's not something it's not a narrative that Fidesz has created, but Fidesz has very clearly tapped into these public feelings and has played on them, exacerbated them. But Fidesz was receiving criticisms of how shutting out vulnerable people is against the Christian value of compassion, which it claims to adhere to. So the government needed to create a more positive message by portraying itself as the protector of Christian minorities worldwide, arguing that we are doing something against immigration. We're trying to support people staying in their homelands, and since we can't support everyone, we are supporting Christians. It's unclear how much this actually resonates with Hungarian voters, but it clearly resonated well with the churches, who are seen as one of the pillars supporting the Orban regime. And indeed, you can also, if you look into the financial details of the Hungary Helps program, there's clear evidence there, and the financial details are pretty murky, and it's difficult to see how exactly or where the money exactly goes. But there's clear evidence that the government is using the program to buy support from churches. Many religious NGOs are beneficiaries of the program, including Hungarian Interchurch Aid, where Orban's wife is a goodwill ambassador, and also charities belonging to the Reformed Calvinist Church, which previously actually had relatively little work in international development and international humanitarian aid. Just to note, Orban himself is a Calvinist as well. I think I'll end here. I think these two examples provide some arguments. I'm not saying it's conclusive evidence or anything, that despite this image of Hungary becoming much more assertive in foreign policy, there's a significant component here of these foreign policy, this foreign policy assertiveness being there for domestic consumption and domestic purposes, showing, trying to back up domestic rhetoric with international actions. So on the one hand, there is greater strategic thinking in Hungarian foreign policy, which is welcome after a decade of drift. Some elements made sense in theory, but most of it is just there to back up domestic rhetoric and may not necessarily be representative of the country's actual interests. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Balázs. Now we turn it over to Dora.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to Thomas Lorman and also to Balázs and to UCL to host this event, a discussion on Hungary and Orban. I would just like to mention that it's increasingly becoming difficult in Hungary to have this kind of open theoretical exchanges of thoughts on Orban and on his government. All right, so I'm going to talk about financial nationalist policies of Orban, and I would be happy to answer questions and discuss further the observation made here. I'm going to explore today Orban government's financial nationalist policies in relation to three theories of financial power from international political economy. I'm going to define financial nationalism following Johnson and Barnes' article, in which they defined it as a subset of economic nationalism that focuses on using monetary and financial policies as instruments to pursue a nationalist agenda. So what I like to point out here is that in defining financial nationalism, it's not necessarily the policy choices that matter, but if they are legitimated through a nationalist ontology, which clearly defines national insiders and national outsiders based on political interest. And the three theories I'm going to examine financial nationalism in relation to are financial structural power of finance, financialization of the state, and financialization of everyday life. In relation to each theory, I will show first that financial nationalism is a countermove of peripheral governments who lack autonomy to manage their dependent financial markets. Second, I'm also going to show that financial nationalism has the capacity to effectively counter the power of finance and increase policy-making scope of peripheral governments. Third, and however, financial nationalism, as it put into practice of economic policymaking, it also undermines democratic oversight of economic policy formation, and it creates economic basis for the authoritarian government. And finally, I'm going to also show that this is all happening within the European Union, and European institutions are complacent at best to these changes and only enforce cosmetic changes. All right, so the first theory I would like to engage with is the structural power of finance. In this approach, ever since Susan Strange, international political economy researchers depict the emergence of global financial structures that are capable of curbing the autonomy of the state through various methods. So here we think about the lobby power of banks or debt market interest in buying or not government bonds. And in relation to this, we can clearly show that Orban and his financial nationalist government was able to resist the power and increase domestic ownership inside the Hungarian banking sector. So the case of Hungarian domestic bank ownership today is that it increased from 24.2% in 2014 to 49.9% at the end of 2008. And here I would like to share a slides with you, which is going to show you a little bit more clearly. So here you see bank ownership in Hungary in percentage of total assets. It is how changing from 2003 to 2017. And here in 2014, we clearly see an increase of first state ownership, then later on with the privatization of MKB, increase of domestic ownership. All right, I'm going to stop sharing it. So domestic ownership of banking, of course, is important because according to a number of theories, through domestic control of banks, governments, so to ensuring this, governments can use these domestic banks to help achieve its development policy goals, help achieve regional and industrial development. So by helping the domestication of financial assets, Orban and his government gained instruments to help him ensure autonomy, provide resources for development projects, and increase stability of the banking sector in times of financial crisis. This is the perceived gain, which actually is also discussed by some of the scholars. However, against this perceived gain, we also have to make very clear that this process of establishing domestic control was itself marred with undemocratic practices and led to a weaker democratic transparency and accountability of economic policy-making institutions, most importantly of the central bank. So the case of MKB, first nationalization, buying it from Bayerische Landesbank, was marred with very unclear and untransparent spending of taxpayers' money. And also the selling price of MKB was very unclear why it was decided at that price. And the authorization of all this was done by the central bank, who did not clearly communicate on any of these instances. Moreover, Orban ally domestic owners became the owner of MKB, and they used them, this bank and also another bank, which is now being merged together into a giant conglomerate of 3 banks. So these domestically Orban ally owned banks continue or increasingly provide funding for other Orban ally businesses, thus serving as a key instrument to establish the economic base of Orban authoritarian rule. The examples that can be mentioned here is preferential credit given to the purchase of one of the TV channels, and also other Orban related businesses gained preferential credits from the domestically owned and Orban ally owned MKB. So in a way, to conclude this point, Orban is capable of countering the structural power of finance. He is, and his government is gaining very important tools to counter the power of finance. However, the process is also marred with very important undemocratic instances. All right, second, I examined financial nationalism in relation to theories of the financialization of the state. According to researchers in this field, financialization of the state is the process of the entrenchment of financial logic into the practices of public institutions that reduce the ability of public institutions to serve citizens in accountable ways. Financial nationalist Orban countered this tendency through its withdrawing from international debt market and only issuing government bonds when it's absolutely necessary. So right now, for example, the COVID crisis makes it necessary. But before that, Orban really was very careful in not issuing government bonds to international market, but mainly to the domestic market. Orban also visits international financial institutions policy advice and their conditionality. Here the reminders, of course, to its countering of the IMF. And most importantly, from my argument's point of view, Orban profoundly distrusts liberal economic expertise. So, because of this distrust in liberal economic expertise, for Orban, it was absolutely necessary to control the independent central bank and put an ally into its governing position. Matolcsi, an Orban ally, entered into power in 2013. And he not only used monetary policy to direct the banking sector's funding into national currency base, this diminishing vulnerability to foreign currency-based loans, but also directed the central bank into many new missions. These missions include the central bank, in addition to being a monetary policy, an institution responsible for monetary policy, became also the bank's supervisor. It also became a development bank as it launched the Funding for Growth program for small and medium enterprises. With the resolution of MKB, the central bank also became a resolution authority. In addition, it also created a relatively large real estate portfolio and became a real estate portfolio manager. It established 6 research foundations to further unorthodox economic thoughts. Recently, it created a regulatory sandbox to help entering into the financial market of fintechs. And it also launched green bonds, and it's entering into and entertaining other green initiatives. All these missions are very important in terms of helping the Hungarian economy to grow. However, on the example of the research foundations, I would like to show how democratic oversight of the central bank throughout this process was sidelined and public funds repurposed for private purposes. After the foundation's creation in 2013, civil society members repeatedly attempted to gain knowledge about the amount of funding these foundations receives. Members of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences insisted on gaining knowledge about the foundations, but both of these civil society actors were just simply rebuffed. And this is very surprising, because when in 2015, the Hungarian public finally learned how much money was allocated to these foundations, they were shocked. The amount was 259.6 billion Hungarian forint, which is roughly $1 billion US. This amount in 2016 was almost double the sum allocated for the entire Hungarian higher education, and it was also close to the Hungary as a NATO member's defense budget, right? So it was an immense amount of money, and we only knew about it because of repeated intervention, not only by civil society, but also by European Union institutions. So the European Union institutions, such as the European Central Bank and the Eurostat, observe these processes with the foundations and influence the central bank to increase the level of its transparency. This is why we know these numbers at all. However, these influences were not successful in a sense that the foundations still operate and they are still designed to pursue unorthodox economic policy, which we really don't know if it is in line with whatever the Hungarian Academy of Science would accredit, right? So the central bank is still enjoying an extreme amount of autonomy in terms of what it's spending public funding, with very little democratic control over it. And the EU institutions are complacent with this. So finally, I would like to address the issue of financial nationalism and its relation to theories of the financialization of everyday life. Here, researchers in this approach point out the high degree to which financial market logics penetrated everyday life of citizens, and that this process increases vulnerability of these citizens and reduces their life chances. It seems that financial nationalist Orban, although was keen on redirecting domestic savings to national currencies and domestically controlled banks, which obviously rearrange households' vulnerabilities stemming from foreign exchange-based saving. However, at a more general level, does not seem to be interested in reversing the course of financialization of everyday life. Some financial nationalist policies of Orban actually take active use of financialized form of social policy that target the middle class. This example includes here the subsidized mortgage loans, and also the recreation of social policy that redirected entitlement-based welfare to income-based welfare financing, which pushed the poorest member of the Hungarian society into the hands of loan sharks. So again, the balance is kind of difficult to draw with regards to this. Again, we'd like to show you a slide, if I can. Here, this slide is household credit to GDP. The red line is what I would like to draw your attention. It's from 2010 onwards, indicates that this percentage of household credit to GDP is actually continuously decreasing in Hungary, right? So in a way, the financial nationalist government is changing the extent to which households' everyday expenditure is based on credit. But however, as I mentioned, this is mainly its concern for the middle classes. The very poor lower classes are still, I mean, I've not shown in this chart, and they basically left after the withdrawal of entitlement-based welfare spending on replacing it from financing from loan sharks. And this is the next slide I would like to show here. The red line is the pre-tax national income of top 10% of the Hungarian population, and the blue line is the pre-tax national income button. And you can see that from 2010, and it started earlier, but basically there is no intention of bringing these two segments of the Hungarian society closer to each other. Okay, I'll stop sharing here. And just very quickly, I would like to conclude. So in some, Orban's financial nationalism has been able to accomplish many and unexpected achievements in the context of global financial power. At the same time, as I argued, there is an underemphasized critical condition of its advancement, namely the diminishing democratic oversight of major financial transformations. So I would like to thank you for listening for my presentation, and also mention that this talk is going to forthcome in a book chapter, hopefully in 2021, titled Financial Nationalism in Line of Post-Crisis Theories of Financial Power. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dora. Tom.
Greetings, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay. My talk tonight, which I'm going to keep very short, is to talk about the sources of Fidesz's electoral success. And what has been striking since the current incarnation of the Fidesz actually a coalition with the KDNP came to power in 2010, is just how electorally successful this party coalition has been under Viktor Orban. They won comprehensively in 2010, they won comprehensively parliamentary elections in 2014, they won comprehensively 2018. And when I say comprehensively, they've hovered around having 2/3 control of the Hungarian parliament. Sensible political analysis looking forward is not about Fidesz being electorally defeated, at least in the near future. It is about whether there is a possibility that Fidesz will not obtain 2/3 majority again at the next major parliamentary election in 2022. In other words, there is a track record of success here, which we have to acknowledge. There have been attempts to put a question mark over that success by arguing that changes to the electoral system or media manipulation is at the heart of the Fidesz story of success. While that is one part of the story, the opinion polling, which we can trace back to the 1990s, presents, I think, a more refined, nuanced picture. If we look at opinion polling, we see that Fidesz's popularity has gone up and down over time. At times it was close to 50%, at times it dropped down close to 20%. But Fidesz has remained the most popular party in Hungary since just after 2006. It's currently the support of those who declare a political preference when asked is 3 times more likely to say they will vote for Fidesz than for any of the opposition parties. The only hope of the opposition to curtail Fidesz's electoral dominance is not, it is simply to try and form some massive coalition of disparate parties to compensate. The reality is Fidesz is popular, immensely popular in Hungary, and not a lot has shifted that, at least compared to the opposition. It remains the only viable government in Hungary at the moment. Where did that come from? And strangely enough, as a historian, to explain the success of Fidesz now and going forward, I want to look back initially to 1990 to 2010, when an entirely different story emerges. In the first 5 parliamentary elections after the collapse of communism in 1989, Fidesz lost 4 of them. In fact, in its one success, 1998, was only a partial one. It was forced to form a 3-party, extremely awkward coalition from 1998, which lost its parliamentary majority in 2001 and was defeated in 2002. In other words, from 1990 to 2010, Fidesz's electoral track record was poor. In fact, in particular, it was the experience of 1998 to 2002, the very first Orban government, which I think played a critical role in ensuring the success from 2010. 3 lessons were drawn from that rather problematic period of Fidesz political history. Yes, they had won the election, but to use a phrase occasionally used about Britain and some of its governments, they were in office but not in power. Why? One, the coalition that they assembled from 1998 to 2002 was very shaky. It was tarnished by infighting, scandals, corruption, and eventually collapse. 2, the optimism of the Fidesz government, coined by its phrase that it used at the time, "the future has begun," was actually confronted by continuing difficulties. Although it was a reasonably prosperous period, in fact, a reasonable period of economic growth, reaching about 4%, I think, on average over the time, it did not fit the ambitions of Fidesz to dramatically transform the country. And there were questions about why that had happened. And thirdly, of course, in 2002, Fidesz lost. From that painful experience, I would suggest Fidesz learned 3 things. 1, winning matters. Fidesz likes winning. Orban likes winning. After 10 years of continuous government from 2010, he remains as hungry to as hungry to win as he was 10 years ago. This is not a party or a government that has run out of steam. It is not content to idly slip back into opposition. It wants to remain in power. 20 years of electoral failure has made Fidesz a party with an insatiable appetite for success. Secondly, Fidesz learned the dangers of infighting. Orban did not like the fact that his awkward smallholder party and collapsing MDF could hold him to ransom during that time in government from 1998 to 2002. The lesson Orban learned and the lesson Fidesz learned is you keep your debates and divisions private. What is remarkable about Fidesz from 2010 onwards is how unified the party appears to be. Essentially, that unity comes from doing as Orban suggests, following Orban's leadership, not challenging Orban's authority. Behind the scenes, there are serious debates and indeed personality clashes. In public, however, Fidesz has presented a remarkable degree of unity that hasn't broken down yet. The third thing is that Fidesz, in its first incarnation in government, did not feel like it could fundamentally transform Hungary. And it put its blame on, if you like, an internal opposition. That is the so-called specialists, the technocrats, the diplomats, the bureaucrats, the independent mayors, and the media, who, it argued, were undermining the government every step of the way, that it faced, if you like, the deep state. And indeed, it picked up on a criticism initially made by the radical right in Hungary in the early 1990s, that or even from some on the liberal left, that the transition away from communism in 1989 had been superficial. That in reality, the communist regime had ended, but the communists had simply adopted a new guise as technocrats, specialists, experts, the experienced, who continue to run the country pretty much as it had always been. For example, unlike in Eastern Germany, where virtually all the academics were sacked after being forced to reapply for their jobs, when I walked down the corridors of the leading Hungarian universities in the early 1990s, I was struck by the familiarity of names with those that had been teaching before 1989. And it wasn't just in the universities where a sense of a lack of real change had taken place. When Fidesz got its second chance at power in 2010, it had a very clear vision that it needed to transform the country by making sure that all critical figures in positions of influence would not be sabotaging the party. What liberal critics or critics of Fidesz would describe as a purge of government, diplomacy, diplomats, etc., was, from Fidesz's perspective, simply about eliminating an internal opposition that was sabotaging its politics and making sure that those people who were involved in the institutions of the state apparatus were supportive of the government's position. More broadly, that initial 20 years of dissatisfaction with electoral outcomes and political power that animated Fidesz from 1990 to 2010 was matched by a sense of dissatisfaction more widely felt by the much of the Hungarian population, and which culminated in the economic crisis that broke out between 2008 and 2010. As such, Fidesz's dissatisfaction with its electoral performance and lack of control of the government matched, to some extent, the Hungarian population's dissatisfaction with the way things had turned out since the fall of communism. While plenty of people had benefited, and there is no nostalgia for going back, I think, among the vast majority of Hungarians to a pre-1989 period, nevertheless, there was a sense that the future had turned out not to be as rosy as people might have dreamed of it in 1990. Fidesz very acutely was able to capture that sense of frustration because it felt a sense of frustration. It was able to argue that deeper and wider changes were needed because it resonated with a part of the population who felt that wider changes were needed. When Fidesz argued that the government, the deep state, had sabotaged its earlier attempts at influence and politics, it matched a wider sense among a part of the population that society had not fundamentally been transformed in 1990. Thus, it was a nice, fortuitous fact for Fidesz that at the very point in 2010 when it took power, the Hungarian population, I think, or much of it, was ready for a significant change. And Fidesz has capitalized on that success and that correlation ever since. I want to finish by suggesting again with my historian's cap on that we need to go even further back to explain what is going on, really. If we go back into the 19th century and trace Hungarian politics right the way through down to today, we can see that the Fidesz's success, the track record of 10 years of political success, which looks like extending, is not unusual. Between 1867 and 1918, essentially one party was in power, the so-called Liberal Party, the Szabadelvű Párt. Between 1920 and the Second World War, again, one party went through a variety of names. Let's call it the Unified Party, won every election. Between 1948 and 1989, again, a single party, occasionally changing its name, was in power. The periods when a single party did not win every election, 1918 to 1920, 1944 to 1948, 1989 to 2010, were exceptions to the rule when different political parties and more complicated coalitions were formed. Those periods also, for those of you who know your Hungarian history, were also periods generally marked by chaos, instability, and serious social problems. The end of the First World War, the end of the Second World War, and the end of communism. In that sense, the return of a stable success of Fidesz since 2010 fits into, I would suggest, a conditioned pattern of political behavior which is fairly normal within the lived Hungarian experience for many people. The idea that a government wins each election does not seem abnormal from a Hungarian perspective. The idea that governments are controlled by political parties and thoroughly perhaps politicized by those parties is again not abnormal. In fact, even in the period after 1989, it would be a myth to claim that there was a depoliticized, fully independent tax office, media, or bureaucracy going on. Each successful political party after 1990 manipulated elements of the government and the media. That had been a long-standing practice of Hungarian politics. In some sense, Fidesz's success since 2010, I want to conclude, is not out of the norm. It's part of a longer pattern. It fits to a pattern of behavior. And while the opposition will continue to complain about it and even raise questions about its legitimacy, I would put it that Fidesz's success rests on a combination of good fortune, drive and ambition, and following a pattern of politics that extends back to the 19th century. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to all of our speakers for such excellent and stimulating presentations. And thank you all for keeping to time. We have almost half an hour for questions from the audience. Maybe to start off with, I would ask the presenters if they have any questions for each other. If you could keep it short, this would be a time when you could field those questions.
I have an observation.
Go ahead.
So I really enjoyed Tom's presentation, and I'm almost fully agree. But as a political economist, I really would like to stress that Fidesz is a system. It's not simply a political phenomena. It's really a political economic phenomena, because it has an economic base through which it recreates its political authority. So that would be a remark. And it has been actually historically the case of all the ruling parties that you mentioned in the past.
Yes, I completely agree with that. In fact, each of the government parties, and I would use that term as a generic term to describe the Hungarian political beast as it's manifested itself since the middle of the 19th century. Each of those political parties, the pre-World War I, the interwar, and even the communists, were, as you rightly say, political economic operations. And I think it's no surprise that Fidesz again has stumbled into that. And I'm very curious, and I'm trying to figure out for myself whether this is a deliberate learning from the past or accidental in its own way. I'm curious about the political, historical, economic, historical thinking that underpinned Fidesz's transformation, and I'm still looking into that. So I think that's a really interesting question, but I think it's absolutely right what you say, that again, and I will use it and steal it when I come to write up my own chapter, that we are talking about a political economic operation. That's part of its success, a critical element of its success. It's also a critical part of what made each of the government parties in Hungary successful. Yeah, thanks.
I mean, just quickly to add to this, how much, I wonder, is this specific to Fidesz or the various Hungarian ruling parties, and how much is this just the playbook you have to follow if you have relatively little regard for democratic institutions and want to stay in power? I mean, we see very similar patterns with other countries around the world sliding into autocracy, and very similar practices which Fidesz is adopting. So I'm not sure that this is purely a Hungarian playbook that's being followed here. It's more rational observation of, okay, we want to stay in power, this is what we'll do to stay in power.
To me, it's not autocracy that we're seeing here. We're just seeing political success, dominant success, remarkable success, determined and focused success. I don't see it as autocracy. I see it as a tough, ruthless politics, which maximizes the chances of victory, because that's what the goal of the political system is, or the goal of the political party. So I don't necessarily think it's comparable to autocracies, which essentially rig the game to ensure success. What Fidesz is very good at playing the game. Whether that is just a uniquely Hungarian game or a more broader game is an open to question. But I think it's more about the skill of Fidesz rather than the autocracy, at least as I understand it, as a political model that essentially simply bends, just rigs it.
Okay, great. Maybe we should now turn to the audience for some questions, and a couple have already come in. First is a question that's written by Stan Varkalov. I think this is a question for Tom in particular, but others may want to ask as well, answer it as well, which is, what do you think about Ivan Krastev's explanation for Fidesz's success, and the argument of Ivan Krastev, which Stan is kind enough to recapitulate here in brief, is an argument which emphasizes demographic change and sort of brain drain and emigration of young people from Eastern Europe, which creates sort of cultural anxiety.
Maybe Dora and Bolos will also be able to speak to this, but to me, I absolutely agree with Krastev's assessment, and I'd go further. I think his arguments are actually both broader and more effective in explaining things. Notably, that the problem of immigration is seen, Yes, that's one of the rewards and fruits of the post-1989 period. There's a great deal of celebration of freedom of movement, but immigration is also painful for those who are left behind, and seen as a real problem, both on a personal level by every family that has lost a child to immigration, and also on a national level as a sense that ultimately people are voting with their feet. And because immigration began to accelerate before 2010, it has initially compounded a sense of frustration with the limits of what was happening in the post-communist era, and Fidesz was able to capitalize on that. So yes, I completely agree.
All right. Ferdinand Juhász would like to ask a question to Balázs, I believe. Ferdinand, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I would have a question for Balázs Szentiványi. You also mentioned that Orban says EU is not the only option for Hungary, but do you think there is really not a realistic option for Hungary besides the European Union? Because I don't think so, but yeah, it could be interesting.
Well, when Orban says things like this, he usually does qualify it a bit. So recently, the most recent time he said it was when he was talking about how brave the British have been to go for Brexit. And unfortunately, Hungary can't do the same. He did use the term unfortunately, because we're too much tied in with the EU's economic structures and it doesn't make sense for us. So Orban acknowledges this. He didn't mention that the EU funds coming into Hungary have been a significant resource that he could then use for patronage, for example. That wasn't mentioned. So he acknowledges this, that there's no alternative. And you're totally correct in saying that there's little alternative for a small open economy than to be integrated with where the markets and where the suppliers are. And there aren't that many markets and suppliers for Hungarian businesses in Russia or in Belarus or wherever. A lot of this is posturing, as I argued in my presentation, for domestic audiences. If Brussels is the enemy, then we have to try and show that we're serious about protecting Hungary and Hungarian interests.
Okay, I'd like to call now on Botond Kerti to come forward with your question.
Okay, so this is more about two questions really, both about the Hungarian opposition and its history. Sort of specifically aimed at Dóra Piroska, since she had talked about how this is a political economic issue, and that Thomas as well, because of the historical sense of this, as you have pointed out, Professor, very accurately, there has always been this sense of weak opposition whenever there was an opposition in Hungary in the past. Right now, there is a slight shift. As we know, the opposition has won the capital, and we can now see a sort of dichotomy between the capital and the countryside in the country. What do you think is the ramification of this? Would you say that there is a realistic chance that this might spread across the country as a new generation grows up that had no experiences of communism? And then the other question connected to that, which is more economical, directly after the fall of communism and the start of privatization, a lot of, how to say this, well, former government officials and people close to the Communist Party became very rich because of having ties to the party, and the party pretty much managing privatization. How come then, if this issue, if this strongman political issue is connected to economics, then that didn't very much translate into into the continuation of opposition, or what would now be defined as opposition power.
Would anyone like to take a stab at an answer?
I could say something very briefly, and then maybe I think maybe Dora would probably be direct. But for me, yes, the opposition has recently won in Budapest. That's not surprising. They won in Budapest repeatedly from 1990 onwards under Dembski. Very briefly, Fidesz was able to achieve success in Budapest. It was rare. It represented really the peak of its popularity, but it was always going against the underlying political current. The critical point is Fidesz wins in the countryside. And I want to give you one example, which is what happened in Győr at the last election, where the man who was running for office, Fidesz politician, running for re-election, who marked himself out as a defender of Christianity and the family, was caught on a yacht off the Croatian coast, receiving oral sex from paid prostitutes. He still got re-elected. If you can't defeat a mayor caught on videotape in a sex scandal, which had to be blocked off YouTube because it was too embarrassing, if you can't beat that kind of politician in Győr, you can't beat anyone. So I think the likelihood is that yes, the opposition can win in Budapest. They always traditionally did win in Budapest because Budapest is Budapest, but 80% of Hungarians don't live there, and they tend to make up the majority of the voters. And just very quickly on generational change, I think the old adage is the true adage that whenever a party can't win, it puts its faith in generational transformation. I don't have much faith in it. People who are growing up in the countryside are shaped by the culture of the countryside. That's unlikely to change.
All right, I also want to say a few things. I'm not sure I will be able to cover everything that you mentioned, but in relation to the economic base of Fidesz, I think it's true to point out that when they came to power in 2010, there was a strong rhetoric about national ownership, and national ownership being the small and medium-sized enterprises, right? And the central bank, of course, created some kind of loans to support small and medium-sized enterprises. But this has dramatically changed over time in the direction of nurturing a large capitalist base connected to Fidesz in various ways. And Mihály Lakis, the economist who very clearly documented through what kind of legal tinkering the enrichment of Mészáros was possible. And in relation to this economic base, I think it's really important to realize that Mészáros and similar tycoons controlled property is not private property. It's controlled, it's a hybrid. It's something controlled both by the government as well as those private owners, right? So I think it's important to realize that what, economic nationalist agenda Fidesz nurturing has also a profound impact on the kind of market economy that is being, consolidated in Hungary. Part of this market economy is a dependent market economy and controlled by multinational corporations. But a very important other part of it is becoming increasingly dominated by Fidesz-related businessmen who pursue a very non-liberal business policy. Okay, so I think it's important to see that as the democratic infrastructure is changing in Hungary into an authoritarian direction, a similar and of course co-defined tendencies happening in the market in terms of the liberal principles of market exchange is being replaced by a hybrid of state and private controlled authority.
Thank you very much, both.
All right, now we have a written question from Corey King to Balázs, which is about Hungary's image as the protector of Christian minorities. What best explains this relationship? To what extent is this friendship based on the notion of pan-Turanism? So this is
Well,
about the
yeah.
relationship with Turkey.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting question, and I'm no expert on the topic of tyrannism, but I think it's the other way around. The friendship with Turkey and also countries in Central Asia, for example, led to the revival of ideas around pan-tyrannism. Turkish people have notions of a close kinship with Hungary, but this is not or hasn't been shared until recently. The image most Hungarians have of Turkey is shaped by historical experience and what people learn in school about the 150-year-long Ottoman occupation of Hungary in the 16th and 17th century. And so there's no strong positive image, historically at least, of Turkey and Hungary. Now, why the government has revived or rediscovered that Hungarians may have Turkic roots, I think that's more an effect of close relations with Turkey. And in a sense, from an economic perspective, if the idea is to have a more global role, increase business ties outside of the EU, then Turkey is a logical destination for that. It's relatively close, it's a large economy, it has a reasonably well-developed economy, so it makes sense to engage with Turkey. And there are all kinds of anecdotes of how well Orban gets along with various strongmen, much better than with democratically elected leaders, but obviously these are more difficult to verify. So the notions of pan-tyrannism, I think, are more being revived as a consequence of this than actually driving any kind of ties or friendship with countries like Turkey.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Now, Rashid Chowdhury would like to ask Balázs a question.
Yes, greetings. Thanks, Jakub, and thank you, Balázs, and the rest of the panelists for a very interesting discussion. So my question is to Balázs is regarding Orban's relationship with Belarus in light of recent events, because as you may know, Orban was in Minsk in June of this year, 2 months before the very disputed election that happened in Belarus in August. And it was pointed out in the Belarusian media at the time that the trade relationship between Belarus and Hungary amounts to about $250 million a year, and largely consists of Hungary importing Belarusian-made Swiss Stadler trains. At least the last couple of years, that's been the substance of the trade relationship. Now, Orban and Lukashenko apparently agreed in principle to increase that to $1 billion a year worth of trade. What, if anything, has Orban had to say regarding the election, though, that happened in August and the subsequent crackdown on the opposition and so on?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I think this was a very delicate area for the government, and you could say that they were pretty silent. Actually, it was very difficult for them to find the right thing to say. Who do you bet on? I think the government had clearly bet on Lukashenko, but then there were the discussions in the EU of how to react. Obviously, Hungary's close ally, Poland, was on a very much different page than Hungary was. So it was a very delicate thing for the Hungarian government. I'm sure they would have been happy to do without it on how to react. And so there was this cryptic statement by the foreign minister saying that we accept the Polish approach, without actually elaborating what the Polish approach is or what part of it they agree with or anything like that. But I think that the main thing there was silence, pretty much, and hoping that this thing blows over.
Okay. Now I'm going to actually call on Philip Barker, who has his hand up, and then we'll move back to the questions in the chat. Philip, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Sorry, just a quick.
Sorry, Philip, you have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, I think I unmuted myself and somehow got muted again. But just a quick note on the idea of Turanism and this link of, Turkic revivalism. This is in fact a very old idea, which goes back to the medieval era, that the Hungarians were linked to Attila the Hun and so on. It was popular throughout the 19th century, but it became particularly politicized in the late 19th century as it became one of the chief kind of ideas of the far right. And what you saw is from the late 18th century onwards, debates over the origins of the Hungarians. One side took the idea based on medieval myths, which were basically without foundation, that the Hungarians were the direct descendants of Attila the Hun. Whereas linguists, some of them based in the Habsburg court, claimed that the Hungarians were in fact Finno-Ugric. And so a battle over Hungarian national identity began throughout the 1800s and the 1900s, with two opposing camps. Ones who based their arguments on linguistic ideas, noting the links between Hungarian and Finno-Ugric languages, and the old Turanian camp, who provided a medley of different arguments, saying that the Hungarians were in fact Turkic in origin. This was more than just a linguistic dispute, because it was highly political. Just to give you an example, and this is something I wanted to ask the panelists about, is that you've not really touched on the political rhetoric of Orban. And Balázs, in your talk, you talked about a global opening, but I think for most Hungarians, they would have thought of it as an Eastern opening, as Orban himself often called it, which was a very peculiar term at the time, because it didn't just potentially mean that Orban wanted to open the economy up to the East, but it played on another very old idea, similar to the idea of the Turkic origins of the Hungarians, that the East was the symbolic home of despotism, and the West was the symbolic home of liberal democracy. And one of the things which the Orban regime has done over the past 10, 15 years is move further and further to the right in terms of its political rhetoric, hollowing out, in fact, the far-right party Jobbik, and taking on many of these kind of ideas which were usually or formerly popular on the far right, one of them being the idea that the Hungarians are direct descendants of the Turks, another one that, as such, the home for the Hungarians was in the East, which is the home of despotism. I don't know if you want to or can comment on any of that.
Thanks, Phil. I didn't want to go into details on this, and obviously this whole debate on Turanism versus Finno-Ugric religions is to a degree alive today as well, and many on the far right don't like seeing it's not only the great legacy of Attila the Hun and everything, but it's also the negative perception of Finno-Ugric hunter-gatherers. No, Hungarians are too great a people to have originated from hunter-gatherers. So there's clearly must have been some much greater legacy. So that's definitely there. Well, the policy was formally called global opening, and originally Eastern opening was a sub-part in it, right? And then there was also a much less publicized Southern opening as well, but that was pretty much dead on arrival. I think. And yes, you're right. Indeed, it was the Eastern opening which received much of the attention, and these symbolic things that we attach to the East and West are actually a very interesting point. I actually haven't thought about that, but it does make sense. So thanks.
Okay. Thanks for this. Let's go back to the chat now. And we have a question from Thomas Rugan, which is, I think, potentially for all of the panelists, and that is, how important do you think cultural policy and control of cultural institutions is to Orban and Fidesz?
I would just briefly say it's critical. It's part of the language of power. Each previous government party used culture to cement its political authority, to interweave political ideology of a party or coalition with the ideology of the country and what was popular about the ideology of the country at the time. So the two are self-reinforcing. And it is the case that in Hungary, since the 19th century, culture has been politicized. Cultural terms have been adopted and absorbed by politicians and used to reinforce politics. The split between culture and politics just has not been there, and that's why I think thinking about Hungarian culture leads to politics, and vice versa. It's why, as a historian, I find it difficult to understand the Hungarian past without looking at the Hungarian present, and vice versa.
I also would like to add maybe here that the way in which I see the control of cultural institution is something which is linked to the systemic undermining of freedom of academia, freedom of media. And so in a way I see it's a continuation and it's really connected. So it's not standing alone, the control of cultural institutions, but it's connected to control in a number of other areas in which freedom of speech is controlled.
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left, and I'm aware that the speakers might be feeling a little bit of fatigue at this point. We don't want to overburden you. Maybe just in closing, I could ask a question or paraphrase a question from Anna Heron here, which is about the effect of the pandemic on any of these dynamics that you've talked about. Do you see the pandemic having any effect on the political economy and or popularity of Fidesz going forward?
Well, just a quick observation, maybe, that Fidesz was very successful in managing the first wave of the pandemic, in a sense that there wasn't a first wave in Hungary as there was in the UK or Italy, for example. They locked down quickly. It was pretty strict, and fatalities were very, very low in comparison. Now we see quite the opposite now in case of the second wave, where daily deaths, and probably as a share of the population, are actually even worse than in the UK at the moment. But the question is, of course, whether this will dent Fidesz's popularity. And, in the past 10 years, we've seen so many things to which people said, okay, this will definitely dent Fidesz's popularity. This will be a big blow to Fidesz. And so far, nothing has been a big blow to Fidesz's popularity, exactly what Tom has talked about. And I guess we unless, I'm thinking, unless there are, and excuse me for this very graphic image, but unless there are piles of dead people on the streets from COVID, I really can't imagine Fidesz's popularity being hurt by the pandemic. Tom is nodding, maybe he has something to add.
Can I, before that, intervene with some economic policy observations? So, in a way, what I see for the economic policy of Fidesz is that COVID is really bringing in a lot of firsts. So this is a first major turn to international debt market to finance the budget deficit. This is very new. The use of development banks as instruments to revitalize the economy is again something which is relatively new. And I'm pretty sure that managing economically the impact of the lockdowns will bring in other new economic policy instruments, which will create experimental experiences for Fidesz that they don't necessarily know how to reintegrate into their past policies. So in a way, I might see some changes, not fundamental one, but some changes. Thomas.
Both the previous speakers have said absolutely. I agree, Balázs, Dora. I agree. And I have nothing more to add. It's very, very well summarized. Yeah.
Okay, well, it's 6:35 here in London, and there are many good questions still to discuss, but I think we should maybe wrap things up for the evening at this point. And once again, I'd like to thank our speakers, especially Tom Lorman for organizing this really stimulating and interesting event, and thank you to all of the audience for coming and joining us here at the Central Europe seminar at UCL-SSEES. And we'll be back for another event on Slovene history on December the 8th at the same time. So thank you all and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.